Joel is going to begin a new series for 4 weeks as we look at some of the opportunities that God is placing before us in the coming year. And as I was thinking about what I might say this morning at 5:30, not a whole lot came. No. I thought maybe I could do a prelude to this series, and I was thinking about this amazing story of one individual. But even as I was thinking about what we are going to be doing in the coming year and the opportunities that are going to unfold before us, I am convinced more than ever that we need to develop an incredible dependency upon God, not only for the future, but for living of every single day. There are many challenges that all of us face in life, and we have many opportunities, but we never know what every day is going to bring. And sometimes it's like a surprise. We wake up and say, God, what's going to unfold today? I can hardly wait to see what you are going to make possible or even relevant. But there are other groups of people who want to have guarantees. They want to have assurances about how life is going to play out. They are very low on risk-taking. And so they like to have things very neat and orderly and a way that they can depend upon for things to unfold. So this morning we're looking at depending upon God, but I want you to think about this question. And this is only something that you can answer in your own heart of hearts. And the question is obviously before you. How much do I or you really depend upon God? Or as we go through life, do we just simply look at the resources that I have within me and the resources that I can gather from around me? And so if I do that, I determine the course of my own future based upon the resources that I have. And so in the reading that was done by Vivian this morning, it's about a man that very little is known about him. He is not an extraordinary individual in terms of a book of the Bible being named after him. There's only a few mentions of his name throughout the book of Judges. But here was a man whose name was Caleb, who is mentioned a couple of times, but in an astounding way, we begin to discover something about this man, because he was a person who depended upon God day after day after day. That was his whole approach to life itself. So as I think of that question, would that be said of me, that I'm a person who really depends upon God day after day after day? So I need to give you a little bit of background to the reading that we had this morning. The first time this man is mentioned, it's in the book of Numbers. And it's in the 13th chapter. And this is what has happened. The children of Israel had been prisoners in Egypt for 400 years. They were slaves in that environment. And God raised up Moses, who led them out towards the promised land. They're on their journey from the bondage of Egypt, making their way to the promised land. And they're about to cross the Jordan River. Before they go into the next part of the land, Moses selects 12 men, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And he says to them, I want you to go and spy out the land. Just kind of fit in and take a look and see what is there before us. Now, of those 12 spies, one of them was this man, Caleb. And we know that at that point in the story, he's 40 years old. So what is the purpose of spying out the land? Well, let me suggest 4 things. The first thing was, take a look and see what the land is like. Hilly, smooth, rivers, whatever. What's the soil kind of like? Then take a look at the people. What are the people like? Are they strong or are they weak? Are they many or just a handful? And then take a look at where they live. Do they live in cities that are fortified, or do they just kind of camp out in the plains? And the fourth one was, what kind of trees grow there? And is there fruit that people can actually consume? Now you need to keep this in mind. They spied out the land for 40 days. So keep that number in your head, 40. You know, 40 is a big number in the Bible. And there's a particular reason why we need to see it here. So for 40 days, these 12 guys are trying to fit in with the culture to figure out what the land is going to be like. So they come back after 40 days. They gather around Moses and the people are there. And they say, the land is abundant with fruit. That's where we get the expression, a land of milk and honey. There's lots there. But the people, we looked at them, and they are strong. They're a powerful people. And the cities, they're fortified, and they're quite large. And the descendants, they're from Anak. They live there, and they're called the Nephilim. Nephilim. Oh boy. The word means giants. The home of the giants. Not the New York Giants. Just the home of the giants. It's a big expression. These people are huge. So obviously, they were quite impressed to some extent about what they saw. So the people have to hear what is going on. And the first thing we discover is that they have a majority version of facing these giants. And 10 men said, we've looked at everything, and this is our report. We're not able to go up against these people. They are too strong for us. And we saw the giants. And look at this. And we became like grasshoppers in their sight, in our sight, and so we were in their sight. You know what a giant does to a grasshopper? It isn't good news. We became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and that's how they saw us as well. Their image of themselves was projected onto the people that they were going to try to overcome. But there's another group, which we might call the Minority Report. And they talked about facing giants, and there were only two who spoke to this report. One was Joshua, who took over from Moses, and the other was this man, Caleb. And this is what they said. But we should by all means go up and take possession, for we will surely overcome it. So there's one group is saying, let's not do anything, let's go back. Other ones are saying, just two, we can take it, we can do it. Now both agreed, the minority and the majority people, that the land was good. But, you ever notice there's always a but? But there are giants, and we are like grasshoppers. And as they spoke to the nation of Israel, what group would they believe? The people believed the majority report, that we can't go and take the land. Do you ever notice how a lot of people are persuaded by the majority? It's so easy to be taken in. You think, well, they must be right because there's so many that think that way. And what happened was the people as a whole turned against Moses and said, why have you brought us here? We were far better off to go back to the land of Egypt. Let us return to the place of slavery. And Joshua and Caleb tried to encourage the people. And this is what they said to them. You need to learn to depend upon God. In spite of all the obstacles that you are going to encounter, will you learn to depend upon God? If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into this land and give it to us. Do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people, for the Lord is with us. and the people rebelled. And God's anger was turned against them. And God wanted to do harm to the people. And Joshua and Caleb and Moses pled with God. And he said, I will not destroy them. But because of their rebellious heart and not willing to depend upon me or trust me, they will wander in the wilderness 1 year for every day they were spying out the land. Remember how many days they spied out the land? 40. How long was the wilderness wandering? 40 years, because they would not depend upon God. And so we find that Joshua and Caleb were the ones who wanted to depend upon God. And the end result was that over the 40-year period, a new generation would rise up. And everyone who left Egypt over the age of 20 never entered the promised land, with the exception of 2 individuals, Joshua and Caleb, because they trusted in God. So now 40 years have passed, and a new generation is on the scene. And we are told from the reading that we had this morning that Caleb is now 85 years young. And he's about to enter the land that God had promised him. And he comes to Joshua, who's now the leader, and he speaks to him and tells him about the events that had taken place 45 years before and the promise that was made to him when he was spying out the land. And Moses had promised the land where he walked to be given to him. And this man is still depending upon God. And this is what he says. So give me the hill country about which the Lord had spoken. And the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out as the Lord has spoken. And he did it. I wondered, what made Caleb a man that could stand apart from the rest of the entire culture? What was it about him that was so different? I believe the answer is simply this. He was a man who had complete faith in God. And he gave himself totally to God. The key, it seems to me, to this type of living is to always keep your eyes upon God and not on the vacillating things that appear before us that can seem threatening to our well-being. Caleb saw the very same things as the other spies did. He saw these giants. He saw the fortified cities. He saw the beauty of the land and the richness of the harvest. But the point of difference between Caleb and the other 10 spies was his awareness of God and their lack of awareness of God. The 10 spies just looked at the giants, they looked at themselves, and they came to the conclusion, this is an impossible task for us to actually accomplish. And so Joshua and Caleb, they looked to God rather than to their circumstances, and they compared God to the giants of the land, and from that perspective, the giants looked like grasshoppers. At times we need to realize that God is calling us to look at our circumstances and situations from a different point of view. We get so caught up looking at our own resources and limitations, and we see challenges before us, and we develop a defeatist attitude. There's an interesting story in the New Testament. Jesus had been teaching 5,000 people. And he said to his disciples, get into the boat and go across the lake. And he went off to a lonely place to pray. And later that night, he moves towards the disciples who are in the boat. And Jesus is walking across the sea. And when the disciples see him, they think it's a ghost. Well, what would you think if you were in that boat? And Peter says, speaks up, and Jesus says, "Why are you afraid? Don't you know that it's me?" And Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, invite me to come to you." And so, this is what he expresses. "If it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Peter got out of the boat, and he started towards Jesus. But here's what happened. He took his eyes off Jesus, and he started to look at the water, and he saw the waves that must have been rolling in, and he started to sink. And he is no longer depending upon God. And this is what happened. Seeing the waves, the wind, he became frightened and cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reached out and picked him up. You see, as long as Peter was keeping his eyes on Jesus, the circumstances around him were not terrifying. But then Peter saw the wind and the waves, and reality set in, and he was terrified. In life, we are going to have setbacks. We are going to have opposition. We're going to have unexpected obstacles that will come into our life. But we are called as the people of God to take risks and to depend upon God day after day after day. But many would rather just play it safe, either stay in the boat or go back to the land that they once knew in slavery. At least we're safe and we're in relative comfort. But you see, God is going to use the challenges that we face every day to develop our ability to trust in Him. That's when faith takes hold. The rubber hits the road when we face obstacles and challenges, and God says, "Will you depend upon me?" Or, will you settle for a life of comfort and never take a risk? I don't think there's any way you can grow in faith unless we decide that we're going to partner with God. About 60 years ago, there was an author whose name was J.B. Phillips, and he wrote a paraphrase of the Bible. But he also wrote a book, and I love the title, and the title was this: "How Big is Your God?" So think about it. How big is your God? There's a second factor about Caleb that I think we need to note. And it's a statement, I don't know if you counted it, but when the scripture was being read this morning, it was declared 3 times. And I think this is the secret of his depending upon God. And that's the phrase that was uttered 3 times in those a short number of verses. "I followed the Lord my God with all my heart." That's what Caleb said. This is what characterized his life. And he was still doing it at 85 years of age. Isn't that kind of amazing? That became his way of life. It wasn't just something that happened here or there, but that was a continuous, actual reality in his life. In the first 40 years of his life, he was born as a slave in the land of Egypt. He was part of that exodus towards the promised land. And now at 85, 20 years past retirement, if he'd lived in Canada, what does he say? He says, "I'm not finished. I'm not finished." He had a distinguished past. He could rest on his laurels, but he would take the land that God had promised to him, and that's what he did. Caleb is a contrast to most people of his day. You see, the people of his generation, only his friend Joshua possessed the land that was given to them by God. All the rest who left Egypt, who were over 20 years of age, never made it to the promised land because they doubted God. Or in the words of Caleb, they did not serve the Lord with their whole heart. Perhaps they were just satisfied saying, "Well, it's not too bad like this. They got used to it. See, today there are some people who want to be followers of Jesus, to be part of the church. But they want the church just to be a place of comfort and predictability. A place where we can get married, buried, celebrate life events, baptized, whatever. We are a people who are called by God to know and to share the heart of God with others. And we are called to partner with what God is doing in this world. It's an amazing challenge. It's actually incredible as a challenge. And so it's going to call for each one of us to rely upon God with our whole heart day by day. We need to realize we can't do the ministry that God has called us to in our own strength. So in the Gospel of John, Jesus said, I am the vine and you are the branches. And notice this, apart from me, you can do nothing. We need to be depending upon God for every situation that we are going to encounter. So one of the people we met in Malawi, his name is Hastings. Hastings rose to a very senior position as a Malawian in a German manufacturing company which is there. He was getting promotion after promotion, and he was in charge of all the machineries and the electrical outlets and everything that worked there. And when people couldn't figure it out what was going on, they called him in. And he said, I felt the call of God to give it all up and to serve the people in the rural areas. And he's a part of the team that we have there. The engineers, the presidents of the company said, why don't you come and work for us? Why don't you keep doing us? He said, I have this call of God in my heart. They said, you're not going to make the money you could have. He said, I know. But he has this expression, when God calls, God provides. And he lives that whole life in joyful abandonment, depending upon God every single day. And we had situations where there were obstacles and difficulties, and he said, but God will make a way. So don't get bent out of shape. He didn't say bent out of shape, but that's the English expression. He believed in a sovereign God who can work in the midst of the day-to-day realities of life. 400 years of slavery, and he was set free. The promised land is before him and promised by God, and he wants to claim it. You see, he saw God's vision, and he partnered with God. So what is God's vision for us? We're going to be exploring this in the next few weeks. But I want to say that I believe the vision God has for us as a people is that we enable others to discover and to know and to share the very heart of God with whomever we meet. Jesus said, I have come to give people life which is eternal and life which is abundant. And we are called to partner with God in his mission in the world. So here is our part. Will you follow the Lord with your whole heart? That means whatever he says, we will do. Wherever he sends us, we will go. No matter the cost, regardless of the obstacles. So here's the question. Will you follow the Lord with your whole heart? Amen? Amen. Let us